Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, pada kesempatan kali ini kita akan belajar mengenal tentang prinsip-prinsip animasi dua dimensi, dimana pada materi sebelumnya atau pertemuan sebelumnya telah dibahas mengenai pengertian animasi dua dimensi itu sendiri. Nah, mengenai prinsip animasi dua dimensi ini ternyata banyak jenisnya, ada sampai 12 prinsip animasi kurang lebih. Nah, pada saat berikutnya kita akan belajar apa saja jenis prinsip animasi dua dimensi tersebut. Baik, pada slide kali ini kita akan membahas tentang jenis prinsip animasi dua dimensi. Namun sebelum kita membahas ke sana, alangkah lebih baik kalian mengetahui sejarah dari prinsip animasi itu sendiri. Pada dasarnya, prinsip dasar animasi pertama kali muncul itu melalui buku The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation pada tahun 1981. Dan prinsip dasar animasi yaitu dapat menciptakan sebuah animasi yang menarik, dinamis, dan tidak membosankan. Dan yang perlu kalian ketahui bahwa dalam pembuatan animasi dua dimensi itu, seorang animator harus memperhatikan prinsip-prinsip animasi dua dimensi. Karena tadi, sesuai dengan prinsip dasarnya, agar yang menonton animasi ini tidak merasa bosan. Seperti halnya banyak film-film kartun yang berdasarkan animasi dua dimensi, seperti misalkan Scooby-Doo, ada juga Naruto, ada juga Tom and Jerry. Nah, animasi-animasi yang tadi Bapak sebutkan itu termasuk ke dalam animasi dua dimensi. Dan jika kalian pernah melihat filmnya atau kartunnya, itu animator pembuat kartun tersebut membuat animasinya sedemikian rupa, semenarik mungkin, sehingga kita yang menonton kartun tersebut tidak merasa bosan. Banyak orang yang menonton kartun Tom and Jerry itu tidak hanya anak kecil saja, tapi di semua kalangan. Bahkan terkadang orang tua pun masih saja ada yang suka menonton film Tom and Jerry. Karena apa? Adanya sisi yang membuat menarik dari film atau dari kartun tersebut. Nah, di sini atau dalam pembuatan animasi dua dimensi, kalian atau seorang animator dituntut agar animasi yang nanti dibuat itu si gambarnya ataupun alur ceritanya itu terlihat menarik, tidak membosankan atau tidak begitu-begitu saja. Ya, makanya ada jenis prinsip-prinsip ini untuk mengacu ke sana. Jadi ketika kita membuat suatu animasi atau suatu kartun, suatu gambar, itu tidak membosankan, dengan cara yang menggunakan prinsip-prinsip animasi yang bisa kalian lihat di slide-nya. Nah, di slide berikutnya kalian akan menonton sebuah video yang menggambarkan atau menunjukkan dari masing-masing prinsip animasi dua dimensi.
Hey guys, so I decided to make a video series dedicated to the 12 principles of animation as described by the legendary animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. So the first principle is squash and stretch. This is the principle that animated objects will get longer or flatter to emphasize their speed, momentum, weight, and mass. Here's a bouncing ball that has squash and stretch. And here is one without squash and stretch. See the difference? The amount that an object squashes and stretches says something about its mass. The more squash and stretch, the softer the object. The less squash and stretch, the stiffer the object. This first one looks like a water balloon, and the second one probably would be a bowling ball. Squash and stretch applies to characters too. Look at how this figure is stretching from the speed that he's coming down with, and then he squashes after he lands, before settling in his pose. You can also use squash and stretch to exaggerate facial expressions. Let's add some squash and stretch to this face. When his eyes are closed, his face is squashed, and when he opens his eyes in disbelief, his face stretches up and settles back to normal. It's very important to keep the volume of the object consistent. This is what a lot of people mess up with when they're first trying to do squash and stretch. They'll elongate the ball like this and flatten it like this. This is what you should not do. The overall volume of the ball must be the same. So as the ball gets longer, it also gets narrower. When it gets flatter, it also gets wider. The same goes with cubes. If you're going in with one line, the other lines must go in the opposite direction. The cube should start out narrow, get flat, get narrow again, and then rest. In-betweening with cubes is easy because you can measure the line in between the two lines and then connect them to make the cube. If you master squash and stretch with cubes, the next step is to try to do it in 3D. Another important note is that the ball does not have to be stretching the entire time that it's falling. When it's just starting to fall, it should have its normal shape for the most part. And then when it's just about to hit the bottom, that's when it has the most stretch. So do not overdo squash and stretch in this sense. Alright, that is all I've got for squash and stretch. The next principle will be anticipation. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next video. This video is based on the 12 principles of animation as described by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Alright, the second principle of animation is called anticipation. This is when a character prepares for an action to give the audience a clue as to what is happening next, as well as to make the action appear more realistic. One example is when a character is about to jump. Before leaping into the air, he has to prepare for the action by crouching down to build energy. It's like a spring that coils up before releasing. Look at this character jumping without any anticipation. It looks very unrealistic because the energy to jump comes out of nowhere. Here's another example, a punch. To add power to the punch and communicate to the viewers that he is about to punch, he reaches his arm back and then punches. By contrast, having no anticipation results in a very weak punch. You'll see this in a lot of cartoons. Before running, a character will wind up before taking off. In the previous video about squash and stretch, this face actually uses anticipation as well. Instead of immediately stretching up, the face squashes first to anticipate the stretch and give it more power. Anticipation helps communicate actions to the audience by preparing them for the next action. This can happen in many ways. If a character is about to take something out of their pocket, they make their hand very visible and up in the air before going into the pocket. Otherwise, the audience might miss it and wonder how they got that object in the first place. The most important thing is that the viewer notices the hand and the pocket, so the character cannot be performing any competing actions. Let's say that something is about to happen on the right. A character may prepare for that action by pointing their eyes and head to look in that direction, leading the viewers to also look there. It's important to make it as easy as possible for the audience to understand what's going on without having to watch it twice. But this can also be used to trick the audience too, if you lead their eyes in one direction and then surprise them by having something happen on the other side of the screen. Taking anticipation a step further, you can actually have multiple levels of anticipation. Let's go back to our punch animation, where the character winds up before punching. This animation has one level of anticipation. Now look at this one. The character is actually winding up for his wind up by going forward, then winding up, and then before punching, he throws his other arm back to further anticipate the punch. This punch is very complex. It's actually similar to what a baseball pitcher does when he's getting ready to throw the ball. Alright, that's all I've got for anticipation. The next principle is called staging. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. This video is based on the 12 principles of animation as described by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. So the third principle of animation is called staging. Staging is the presentation of any idea so that it is completely and unmistakably clear. This is a very broad principle because it covers so many areas of animation. It can apply to acting, timing, camera angle and position, and setting. So when you're animating, you want to be in full control of where the audience is looking. You're essentially saying, look at this, now look at this, and now look at this. This control is achieved through staging. All of the elements of the scene work together to move the viewer's eyes around the screen. Here's an example of bad staging. The characters are competing for stage presence, so the viewer doesn't know which one to look at. The camera has a lot to do with this. It's important to know when to be close up and when to be far away. Far away is good for big actions, while close up is good for expressions. Don't have the main action be off to the side. It should be either in the center of the screen or in one of the thirds of the screen. If they're facing to the side, there should be more empty space in the direction that they're facing, unless someone's sneaking up behind them, in which case they would no longer be the main character of the shot. The main action of the scene should be very clear and simple. It can't be upstaged by other things that are going on. This takes attention away from the main point. It should also have proper timing. Let one action finish before the other person starts their action, instead of overlapping them. Sometimes you need to insert pauses if there's something on screen that needs to be processed by the viewer before moving on. Sometimes if there's any text on the screen, you should keep it on screen for as long as it takes to read it out loud 3 times. But it's not just about controlling the viewer's eyes, it's also about conveying ideas. If a character is sad, for example, you want to make sure that the viewer knows that and feels that. If someone's house is supposed to be very poor and decrepit, go over the top to make sure that they get it, and don't have any objects that detract from that purpose. Let's take this scene and give it the staging treatment. This fat guy is eating pizza. The idea that we want to convey is that he is a severe overeater. So let's set the stage more. Let's give him more pizza and put piles of pizza boxes behind him and stains on his shirt. Let's move the camera down below him to make him look bigger. And let's change his acting so that his weight actually gets in the way of his eating, so he can't even reach for the soda without falling over. Now let's make sure to time it right so he notices the soda and then reaches for it. Now the idea is very clear. So that's all I have for staging. The next principle is called straight ahead and pose to pose. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. This video is based on the 12 principles of animation as described by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Alright, so the 4th animation principle is called straight ahead and pose to pose. This term describes 2 methods used to animate drawings. The first method, straight ahead, is where you draw the first drawing, and then you draw the second drawing, and then the third drawing, and so on. It's basically animating as you go. The second method, pose to pose, is where you draw the beginning and end of each main pose and go back later to fill in the drawings in between. So there are benefits to both methods. Pose to pose is generally better for most actions because it gives you the most control. You have a good idea of what the action is going to look like very early in the process. So instead of worrying if the character is going to end up in the right place, you decide where they end up from the beginning and work backwards. Also, using straight ahead animation can lead to the character changing size or being on a different level from beginning to end. Pose to pose can save you a lot of work. If you were to animate a whole sequence straight ahead and then realize that one pose is off, you would have to change several drawings to fix that one pose. But with pose to pose, you do the main poses to see if it feels right, and you can catch problems early on. Straight ahead animation, on the other hand, is good for animation that is unpredictable. Some examples of this include fire, water particles, clouds of dust, explosions. The reason why straight ahead works well is because there are laws of physics that work at a constant rate, and it's hard to predict how it will work pose to pose. So when animating fire, for example, you just go with the flow based on what you know about fire, and let the fire kind of create itself. If we were to look at the beginning and end, we wouldn't even know how to in between it. However, you can still use pose to pose to make the general shapes and fill it in between to make it smoother. Another example of unpredictable animation is overlapping action, which will be covered in depth in the next video. Let's say that a character has floppy ears. You could draw the figure with his ears for each pose and just draw the in-betweens accordingly, but another method is to animate the figure using pose to pose without the ears, and then going through and adding the ears using straight ahead. This is good because you can focus on the figure's movements without the distraction of having to do his ears, and you can also focus on the physics of his ears without the distraction of his body's movement. This also applies to hair, tails, and other appendages. When you work pose to pose, there's some vocabulary that goes into it. There are main poses called keys, secondary poses called extremes, and further broken down poses called breakdowns. Make the keys first, perfect them, then decide the farthest the character will go in each direction using extremes, and then decide how you want the extremes to connect using breakdown poses. At this point, you can start in-betweening. Working with this sort of hierarchy will give you the most control as opposed to doing your pose to pose straight ahead, so to speak. This is like pose to pose within pose to pose, because you are perfecting the poses at each level before moving down to the next level. So that's all I've got for straight ahead and pose to pose. The next principle is called follow through and overlapping action. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.